Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, kind of doing a bit of an in-depth deck guide on Selesnya Angels. Now, we've already taken a look at this at our deck overviews, and we've done some gameplay with Selesnya Angels, both in the Pioneer format and the Explorer format, so this is a lot based off of my experience with the deck. So, may not be completely gospel, but I have probably a good 70 area matches under my belt with this deck at this point, have a pretty good idea of at least general overviews for the deck. So it comes down to basically two different builds with the Selesnya variant of the deck. The first one involves the mana dorks, such as the one present in front of you, Elvish including Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves. The main difference of the other build is it's a little bit more mid-rangey, focusing more on 2-drop angels, and some of those variants also play Nykthos Shrine to Nyx to be able to get a little bit bigger of Kalia's Reconstruction. Now, Angels is very much a tribal deck based around the life gain synergies of the cards Bishop of Wings, which triggers for every angel that comes into play, Righteous Valkyrie, which triggers for each angel or cleric, of which Bishop is a cleric, to gain life equal to their toughness, and the card Resplendent Angel. Whenever you gain 5 or more life during a turn, you can create a 4/4 angel at the end step, and it has its ability to pump itself for the later game. The rest of the deck is designed around maximizing the power of that, and as a result, this deck is a little bit can be very polarizing in some of its matchups as a result, but we'll talk about that in a bit. The rest of the deck is generally a bunch of angels. Giada is a legendary angel that you can drop on turn 2 that can pump the rest of your team as they come into play, plus you have the ability to use it to help cast your angel spells. Skyclave Apparition is generally the removal spell of choice in these decks. While it doesn't have any tribal synergies, it is a nice removal spell that you can have, and the fact that your opponent doesn't get the card back whenever it dies, they get a token on the ground that you don't generally care about. The rest of the deck, a bunch of lands, notable ones that you get to play, things like Boseiju, Ganjo. Sometimes you'll see man lands in these lists. Some variants also will try to skimp on colored sources to play something like Mutavault. But generally, 23-24 lands, you might see some modal spells that we'll talk about in a minute. Collected Company and Kalia's Reconstruction are very powerful tribal synergies, or creature-based synergies, since the vast majority of your deck is 3 or less CC. This allows you to hit a bunch of angels at instant speed, and Kalia's Reconstruction scales with the amount of mana you pump into it. Obviously, you can sometimes miss. Kalia sees 7 cards, Collected Company sees 6. And then another thing about Kalia is something you may not realize on the surface of it, is in the post-board games when you're boarding in some amount of artifact hate cards, things like Pithing Needle, Damping Sphere, Unlicensed Hearse, you can also hit those off of this card. The other variant that we will talk about is the non-Mana Dork variant. This skips on the Mana Dorks to be able to play things like Youthful Valkyrie. You play a few more in terms of creatures. You play that, you get to play. Really, that's the main difference, is you play Youthful Valkyrie. Sometimes you'll see more 3-drop angels. But beyond that, it just comes down to, do you want to have that bad top deck in the late game, or do you want to have that little boost of speed in the early game? Little boost of speed is critical in several matchups that we'll talk about later when we talk about specific matchup breakdowns. But a lot of it comes down to, do you want to play Mana Dork on 1, get your game plan rolling early, or do you want to have a little bit more resilient of a more slightly mid-range tribal theme? The sideboard cards you can play are a little bit different. We'll talk about some of them in a little bit of detail, but mainly it comes down to interaction for your opponent's creatures, things like Portable Hole, Declaration in Stone, Skyclave Apparition, those kind of cards. Hate cards for your opponent's strategy, things like Rest in Peace, Damping Sphere. Rest in Peace being very key against any type of graveyard nonsense. Primarily Is It Phoenix and Greasefang variants. Damping Sphere, very important against Lotus Field, also helps to slow down Nykthos ramp. And then Pithing Needle can just kind of be a catch-all for annoying things, planeswalkers like Liliana the Veil. The other branch of cards you'll see brought in is anti-attrition cards, whether those be things like Shaper's Sanctuary, Reckoner, Bankbuster, various planeswalkers, including a Johnny, Archangel Elspeth, Invasion of Gabagood, whatever, against sweeper-based decks. So a lot of different cards, but they all break down into certain things. Very similar to decks with tribal synergies, you generally can't board out a lot of cards. You're generally boarding out whatever is the weakest creature in the matchup. Sometimes that's Skyclave Apparition, sometimes that's the Mandorks if you run them, sometimes you're shaving on other angels that just aren't as important to the thing. Things like Inspiring Overseer, they're largely placeholders in the deck. The strengths and weaknesses of the two styles, the more mid-range version is a little bit better against the other mid-range decks of the format, you know, like Rakdos Midrange. Those kind of things. You have a lot more hits off of your collected company that kind of matter. The downside of it is in the matchups that you struggle against, decks like Mono Green Ramp, decks like Greasefang, you have less nut draw potential. 1 drop into 3 drop into collected company, which can kind of steal you those games in otherwise very difficult matchups. Those are very much negated by the fact you don't have the Mandorks and you're a little bit slower. So it comes down to, do you want to be faster against your bad matchups and have a prayer in those matchups, or do you want to be a little bit slower and a little bit more resilient and have those a little bit less bad top decks in the mid game? All right, we're going to take a look at a few opening hands and playing out a couple turns with each of these and goldfishing things. This hand's a bit risky in the form of one of the risks of Mandorks is it does increase the amount of mana creatures or mana sources you have, which means you can flood out. The one saving grace of this hand is you do have a Kalia's Reconstruction, but generally being able to go 1 drop into 3 drop into a Kalia's Reconstruction or a Collected Company on 4, I think this hand has just enough upside to risk keeping the 5 mana sources. Drawing another Giada, not the best. Drawing another mana source. Once again, we've already kind of talked about the downside of this particular hand. And we get to attack in with Giada. So, like you see, this hand does have some risks associated with it, like the inability to really do anything. The positive with this hand, obviously, you know, your Kalia's Reconstructions and such are very powerful. But the rest of your hand is, you know, kind of risky on reliant on hitting your big plays. And then, you know, it's kind of drawing all of our Giadas. And then this also illustrates the other sometimes downside of this variant is the fact that you sometimes hit Mandorks off of your things. But I think this was a good example of, you know, a hand that has some risk, some upside, but is probably not a mulligan, especially if you were to hit non-Giada Angels off the top, like Inspiring and Resolute Arc. If you were to hit some of the other things like Resplendent Angel or Inspiring Overseer off the top, this hand would have gotten a lot better before it did. And then obviously, you know, the downside of playing all these legendaries, generally you're not going to see this. You might run into 1 or 2, and Giada is a creature that does tend to die a lot. But let's take a look at a few other mulliganing option hands. All right, taking a look at another opening hand. This hand is in the dark. I might mulligan this hand simply because Bishop of Wings and Skyclave, while they are decent role players in the deck, you really don't have any of your angel synergies. You have no angels, you have no collected company, you have no Kalia's Reconstruction, and you have 5 lands, so this hand just doesn't feel like it has enough. This hand is a bit risky on 6. I'd probably put back the Kalia's Reconstruction and keep. The reason why is this deck is obviously a tribal synergy deck. Doesn't particularly operate well on low resources. One of the positives of this hand is Giada is a mana source in case we didn't draw this Elvish Mystic. So we would do this turn, attack with Giada, play Resplendent Angel, play Mana Dork, and then a lot of times with this deck you're going to actually main phase your collected companies because you want your synergies to trigger during your turn. Here you would take Righteous Valk and that, trigger some life gain, any order, and then continue to attack. And then next turn get to follow it up with Collected Company. So like I said, the first hand was very borderline. The second hand was decent with the downside of having to need to draw land, but on 6 I think that's a reasonable enough hand. And then, you know, going to 5 is really risky for any type of tribal synergy deck if you're facing any type of attrition or something. Taking a look at one more hand, this hand is almost perfect in terms of what you're trying to execute. You get to go 1-drop, 3-drop, and so on. This hand's a very easy keep. Kalia's Reconstruction makes it potentially even better. Even if your mana dork dies here, you would still have a play in Giada. Here you want to get Righteous Valk down because it sets up the rest of your deck. 1, 2, 3, play this tapped. Play 1, 2, 3, 4. You'd still be able to only play Overseer here. This will enable you to gain some life. Pass, obviously you get an attack in here, but we're trying to keep our own life total high. So here we have access to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mana. So you have two choices. You can either go Kalia's Reconstruction for 2, looking for Resplendent Angel, or you can go Giada into Righteous Valk. I think given the almost guarantee here, I would go Giada into Valk, because this should be enough to trigger your Righteous Valkyries pumping, hitting for 12. The plus side of Kalia's Reconstruction is you might be able to hit like Bishop and Resplendent Angel and still pump the team and, you know, get a 4/4 Angel at the turn. Really it comes down to, you know, do you want to take the guarantee with what's in your hand, or do you want to roll the dice for the slightly higher upside? That's kind of a look at mulliganing with the Mana Dork version of the deck. We're going to take a look at a couple hands without the Mana Dorks. Alright, taking a look at this opening hand, keeping in mind we don't have the Mana Dorks to back us up anymore. This hand seems alright. We've got Giada into either Youthful Valk or Resplendent Angel. Skyclave can either be a creature here or a land, depending on how the rest of our hand shapes up. Alright, so we can play this as a tap land for now. Pass. Play the Thicket. Run out Giada. Okay, so we get a 3-drop down, or we can just play Youthful Valkyrie. Obviously we attack with Giada. Then go ahead and play this. Play out Resplendent Angel. And attack. Another Resplendent Angel here, so we can actually get multiple things down here. Attack with these two. Then we can play Youthful Valkyrie. And we can play this. And next turn we'd potentially be able to attack for a lot of damage. Flooding out a little bit here. Skyclave to kill something. This is only to cast Angel spells, not to use Angel's abilities. This was to use Angel's abilities to be significantly better for Resplendent Angel, but you kind of get the idea of how the deck's just a little bit slower to develop with the Elvish Mystics, without the Elvish Mystics and such, but they are. It does have a little bit better top decks, but it is a little slower bit to develop. Alright, this hand is a pretty good opening for this deck overall. It kind of shows the sequencing issue of Bishop of Wings and things like Youthful Valkyrie and Giada. You want to get the Bishop of Wings down early because it functions as a blocker and is kind of a buffer against removal. Forces your opponent to remove it, or they're going to be giving you spirits every time your angels die. The one situation where you don't really care about Bishop of Wings is if you're in a situation where maybe Resplendent Angel isn't necessarily in the picture, and you just need to get your flying force down and pressuring your opponent as quickly as possible. It's a bit of a give-take because Bishop can, especially in combination with whatchamacallit, can pump the rest of your team. But overall, on this hand, I'd lead on the Bishops and then play the Righteous Valk. So play this tapped. go. Another bishop. I think this turn we just lead on our 3-drop. So while we're not going to be able to trigger the angel quite enough this turn, next turn we will be able to lead on this. That was foolish. So we would be able to trigger Resplendent Angel here, and then get an angel on end step. Kalia's Reconstruction. And we kind of get a good idea of how powerful this card is, but you might also see the variance side of it. All right, so Righteous Valkyrie and Giada. This is what I was talking about with Bishop helping to pump your team, only really if Righteous Valkyrie comes in the equation. If Righteous Valkyrie is not part of the equation, then it really doesn't do a lot to help in your racing situations. But here, obviously, it's going to, do a ton of different things. This is a good example of the Angel deck going absolutely nuts. There are times where you can just have 1 or 2 creatures in play, hit a Collected Company, or hit a Kalia's Reconstruction, and all of a sudden you're gone from like 16 life to like 48, and all of your team is buffed, and you're really beating down your opponent. Kalia's Reconstruction is probably your best late game top deck in a lot of situations. It's good after sweepers generally, it's good against an attrition game plan, etc. But, it does get a little bit weaker if you have Mana Dorks in terms of the hits off of it. It gets better if you have Mana Dorks to pump up the amount you can get off of it. So it really comes down to your preference of, do you want to improve your bad matchups a little bit better, or do you want to have those little extra top decks? All right, so talking quickly about matchups and how to sideboard in those matchups. Most of my experience is based off of the Mana Dork version, so I'm going to kind of be talking in the frame of reference to that, using this as an example list. First up, Rakdos Midrange. Rakdos Midrange, surprisingly, both statistically according to Frank Carson's latest article from the regional championships this past couple of months, and both my own experience with the deck, Rakdos Midrange is actually a fairly reasonable matchup. Game 1, they do have spot removal, they do have pressure, they do have things like shouldered and such, but it really comes down to your creatures fly, their creatures don't. And a lot of their removal spells don't actually line up against your deck. For instance, Fatal Push needs to be revolted to kill a lot of your creatures. Bone Crusher Giant doesn't kill a lot of your creatures other than your Mana Dorks and your Giadas. At least the creatures that matter. So a lot of their, and even sometimes they play the 2-mana removal spell Power Word Kill. Can't kill an angel. Kind of a nightmare scenario all the way around. And Heartless Act can get a little bit bad in the face of Giada pumping out counters on some of your other more important angels. The post board gets a little bit rougher for you as, against most creature decks, they have sweepers to bring in, generally speaking. Extinction Event, those kind of things, Languish, etc. As far as sideboarding in and out, generally speaking, when I sideboarded with this deck, I boarded out some amount of the Mana Dorks and boarded in whatever attrition card you happen to have, whether that was Shaper's Sanctuary, whether that was Takasia's Welcome, or however you spell that. It's a 3-mana enchantment that draws a card for every time a 3-mana creature or less comes into play. Takasia's Welcome. Invasion of Goblin, maybe, maybe not. But generally, Shaper's Sanctuary, Reckoner Bankbuster, any 3 or 4 mana Planeswalkers you might have floating around. The cards you're bringing in the attrition matchups, you shave some of the Mana Dorks, bring in some of your attrition cards. Really don't cut anything else. Bishop of Wings is good against the removal. Inspiring Overseer is good against decks that are trying to attrition you. Helps you to dig closer to your Collected Companies and Kalia's Reconstructions, which are really the cards that I think swing the deck, or swing the matchup as, constant 2-for-1s or sometimes 3 or 4-for-1s with Kalia's Reconstruction really can be too much for Rakdos to handle, as it really is designed to face tribal decks, but not necessarily a deck playing 8 Collected Company effects. Alright, next up, Mono Green Devotion. This is where things get a little rough. Devotion, very much about speed. One thing that Angels gives up is speed. It is not the fastest creature-based deck. It doesn't have a ton of disruption. Its strategy mainly relies on its absurd amount of life gain and the synergies off of that. Mono green doesn't really care about that. That said, your best hands against them are usually 1-drop into 3-drop in the Collected Company or Kalia's Reconstruction, and potentially you can get them. Pelucranos Reborn and Cavalier of Thorns are really key cards in that matchup, as well as Karn and Karn's Wishboard, Sky Sovereign, Cityscape Leveler. Really anything that deals with your creatures can be a nightmare scenario, and the fact that they can put a bunch of big butts that have reach can really cause problems. That said, your best strategy in that deck is not against that deck is not to sideboard too heavily. You can bring in things like Portable Hole, things like Pithing Needle or Damping Sphere. Sphere is a little iffy because, yes, it does slow down Nykthos, but it's not great. Needle helps shut down Karn, which can be a real nightmare. But beyond that, a little bit of disruption of things from the form of things like Portable Hole and such. Cards I tend to cut in that matchup, Skyclave Apparition, while it can slow down them a little bit, I might shave 1 or 2, simply because the only one that's really worth hitting by the time Skyclave Apparition comes down is either Wolf Willowhaven or Kiora. Other cards you can consider shaving, maybe a copy or 2 of Inspiring Overseer, but you generally don't want to sideboard too heavily for that matchup. Just some amount of Portable Holes, maybe some amount of Pithing Needles, some amount of Damping Spheres, but overall the matchup is very unfavorable. Third up, Rakdos Sacrifice. Now, this is a matchup that is a little bit closer than Rakdos Midrange. While I would say Rakdos Midrange in general is probably a slightly favorable matchup for Angels, I would say Sac is very pilot dependent on the Rakdos Sac player. If the Rakdos Sac player is very good and knows how to get every inch of their deck, it's going to be a rough go for Angels. That said, your best cards are still Collected Company and Kalia's Reconstruction, as at the end of the day, they are still an attrition-based anti-creature deck. That said, things like Mayhem Devil, Claim the Firstborn with their Sac outlets, those kind of things can really hold back your ability to exploit your tribal synergies. Your mana dorks get a little bit worse, once again, much like they do against the Rakdos Midrange list, so you're going to be boarding some of those out. You're going to be boarding in whatever attrition cards you have, especially cards like Bankbuster, Shaper's Sanctuary, Pithing Needle to help shut down things like Witch's Oven, and potentially back end of Fable. But generally you don't want to be sideboarding too heavy. You can bring in a couple Portable Holes. It's basically cutting mana dorks, bringing in your anti-attrition stuff, bringing in a little bit of interaction for their annoying stuff. Skyclave Apparition, not the best in that matchup, though it can kill a Mayhem Devil or something, but oftentimes is just going to die to their various ground pounders. So you might want to shave 1 or 2 of those to bring in your more stable removal spells. And the matchup itself, somewhat close. I think the edge goes to Sac, especially if the pilot is very good. Mono White Humans, one of the reasons this deck exists. These are 2 ships passing the night. Humans are trying to get you dead. Angels are trying to gain an absurd amount of life. Generally, if you have a reasonable draw, the absurd amount of life is going to trump the Humans deck. The Humans deck is going to bring in some amount of removal in the post-board games, especially. If they're not running Brave the Elements, they're going to be bringing in Ossification, Portable Hole, any type of removal they might have. As far as stuff you bring in, honestly, I wouldn't bring in a whole lot. You could bring in some number of Portable Holes, Skyclave Apparitions if you wish, shaving things like Inspiring Overseer, or potentially a copy of something like Kalia's Reconstruction, as it can be a little bit taxed with things like Thalia and such. And this isn't terribly too much an attrition matchup. It's more of a speed matchup. Can you get your life gain online before they can get you dead? Generally speaking, that answer is yes. You don't want to board out too much. This is definitely a matchup where the mana dorks, they kind of shine, but at the same time, they can be a liability if your opponent's got turn 2 Ossification on the play, that kind of stuff. So mana dorks can help with the speed element, but generally speaking, both variants of Angels, whether you're playing dorks or not, are generally going to have a very good time against humans. Like I said, you don't want to board too much in, maybe a couple of your removal spells. If you're playing something like Settle the Wreckage, you might board that in. But otherwise, this is one of Green-White Angel's bread and butter matchups. Azorius Control, be prepared to die. This is kind of a nightmare matchup. They have cheap counter spells, sweepers, early removal, all of which is a nightmare for this. Your best cards in the matchup, Collected Company, Kalia's Reconstruction, any type of non-Shaper's Sanctuary attrition cards, Bank Buster, Planeswalkers, those kind of things. The downside is a lot of the things they're bringing in to counter your Collected Companies and Kalia's Reconstructions are also going to hit most of the cards you bring in against their attrition plans. Supreme Verdict's a nightmare. Farewell's a nightmare. Your best ways to win the game generally: 1-drop, 3-drop Collected Company, pressure, 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 force them to sweep, have a Collected Company, the end step that they swept, and then continue the pressure on from there, and then try to chip shot in that last bit of damage. This is where something like Mutavault really helps as well, but obviously most decks have kind of gone away from that to do the mana restrictions. But generally speaking, one of the worst matchups for this deck, and kind of the results kind of bear that out, as you have like I think it's like a 30 or 40% win percentage against the deck, and it's just a nightmare overall. The Azorius Field, or the Lotus Field version of the deck, not a whole lot better. You're still facing a ton of sweepers, so just when you sign up to play this deck, it's a deck you're likely going to lose against. Next up, Greasefang. Greasefang, not a good matchup. They're faster than you, they can hit hard, and their post-board plans are generally still pretty reasonable against you. Sure, you have certain hate cards, Rest in Peace, Unlicensed Hearse. This is another matchup where the Mana Dork version shines. 1-drop into 3-drop in the Collected Company. Once again, your Nut Draw can outpace their turn 3 Parhelion draws, but generally they're going to be much more effective at executing their optimal game plan than you are. Also, Sky Sovereign can also be a nightmare against certain of your creatures, killing everything but Righteous Valkyrie in one shot. So often they can go 2 for 1 with Sky Sovereign. The only card you don't typically care about a ton is Chariot, but Chariot does bring in a lot of pressure, so can be a bit of a risk. As far as what you board in and board out, Inspiring Overseer tends to be the one that I board out the most. Obviously, you're bringing in your Rest in Pieces. You're bringing in any type of hate for the graveyard or for the vehicles. Pithing Needle is another card you can bring in. You can bring in Skyclave Apparition, but unless you're Collected Company into it, the damage is already generally done once Greasefang's been in play for a turn. So generally you want to bring in your graveyard hate pieces, your Pithing Needles, board down on Inspiring Overseers, maybe shave something like a Kalia's Reconstruction, as sometimes this matchup is more about speed than attrition, but having your attrition game plan can be important if the game goes a little bit longer and if you're trying to grind through a Parhelion or 2 hit. So Spirits. Spirits is a deck that I don't have a ton of data as far as backup on, but in terms of the gameplay of how it feels that Spirits' better draws are going to get under your better draws. It feels like a close-ish matchup, but it feels like whoever wins the game kind of runs away with things. If Spirits is executing their 1-drop Curious Obsession, counter your spell, bounce your thing, get more Spirits into play, counter your thing, that game is going to go very well for them. If you happen to go 1-drop, 3-drop Flyer, Collected Company, and they're still struggling to get on the board, you're generally going to kind of win those games in a landslide. As far as stuff to bring in, maybe Portable Holes. The problem is they play at instant speed, you play at sorcery speed. If you get your bodies into play, they're generally going to lose. If they can keep you from executing their game plan, they're going to win. So matchup feels a little bit close, but from what I've seen, it feels like Spirits generally comes out just a little bit ahead in this matchup. Once again, I may not have enough experience with it, but it does feel like a bit of a rough matchup. Not really a ton to board in and board out. Maybe you can bring in a couple of your removal spells for a little bit more of your expensive spells against the decks with Geistlight Snare, etc. Lotus Field combo, it's all about speed. The downside of the Angels deck, speed is not its strength. Lotus Field is a turn 4 combo deck generally, turn 4, turn 4.5. Generally, Angels kills around the same time frame. They also have to bring in sweepers post board, so bit of a nightmare matchup. A lot of what we do doesn't interact favorably with what they do. We do sometimes have some sideboard cards. Tonic could be a card. Damping Sphere is usually the most frequent. Pithing Needle can be a card you would bring in that matchup. As far as cards you would trim, Skyclave Apparition, generally not very good in that matchup. As the first cut, Inspiring Overseer, maybe cutting a copy of that. You don't want to bring in a ton of hate cards, but you do want to bring in your Needles, your Spheres. Other cards you might have, Arcana of Emeria, Redain can kind of be an annoyance for them. So anything that taxes what they do, those are the kind of cards you bring in. I almost forgot Arcana of Emeria because it's not in the version that we're currently looking at, but certainly one of the cards you want to bring in, shaving some copies of Inspiring Overseer and slotting those in your 3-drop slot. That said, overall, feels like a pretty bad matchup, and I think the statistics have kind of bared that out. Final matchup we're going to talk about. The statistics say, according to Crane Karsten, at least in the small sample size, that this is kind of a close matchup that Fires is a little bit favored in. Enigmatic Fires, that's the deck that can play either Kruger or Yorion. It's a bunch of powerful enchantments backed up by a bunch of powerful creatures. Once again, they kind of go over the top of what you're doing. The downside for a deck like us, if they're on the Yorion version, they get to play things like Chain to the Rocks, in addition to Leyline Binding and some number of sweepers. If they're on the Kruger version, they get to play Leyline Binding, sometimes Bone Crusher Giant, sometimes Temporary Lockdown. All those cards disrupt us just long enough for them to get their game plan online, and generally their game plan just wipes out what we do. You can certainly go over the top of what they're doing with your a really good Kalia's Reconstruction or a really good Collected Company and getting a bunch of life, kind of one-shotting them out of nowhere. They don't have a ton of flying blockers. They have Atraxa. They can have Titan of Industry. But a lot of their things are ground pounders. So that sweet spot for the matchup for us is between turn 3 and turn 5. Anything that goes beyond turn 5 is a nightmare overall. They start getting things like Sheoldred and Elesh Norn, which this deck cannot beat Elesh Norn. Unless you're in an overwhelming powerful or board position when Elesh Norn comes down, you're not beating Elesh Norn. It shuts down all of your ETB triggers and is one of the worst cards for this deck to play against. That said, you do have some hope and prayer. Your aggro draws can kind of kill them before they can get set up, especially game 1 when they don't have as much hate, whether it be Chain of the Rocks, Leyline Binding, Sweepers, etc. The post-board games get a lot rougher once they know what they're mulliganing for. That said, typically you're bringing in your attrition cards. I really wouldn't bring in Shaper's Sanctuary per se, but it can be alright. I wouldn't honestly bring in a whole lot in that matchup. Your thing is trying to go as fast and streamlined as you can. That said, you still might bring in some Bank Busters or something like a Johnny, potentially wipe their board. I did forget, a Johnny is a card I haven't seen a lot of, I haven't played a lot of, but from what I've understood from the Angels community, basically it's for the mirror match to wipe the board, and it's for mono green to wipe the board. So I forgot to mention that in the mono green thing, but I am mentioning here as it is a card that you can use to wipe Enigmatic Fires board and have a prayer in the matchup. We'll be covering one more matchup, and that is Boros Convoke. Alright, Boros Convoke. Much like Mono White Humans, that's a reason to play this deck. They try to put a whole bunch of damage on the board. You try to gain a whole bunch of life. Generally, life gain wins. Key sideboard cards. Maybe a couple portable holes to disrupt their 1-drops. Really kind of 2 ships passing in the night. Your game plan generally trumps theirs overall. And is really one of the reasons to play Angels. In a quick wrap of Angels' positioning in the format, Angels is a very middling deck. There are 3 matchups that I would say are pretty conclusively ahead for Angels. That is Humans, Boros Convoke, and then obviously if you play against Mono Red. But I feel like Rakdos Midrange is also a positive matchup. Matchups that are Dumpster Fire terrible, Blue-White Control and all of its variants, Lotus Field Combo, and Mono Green are all terrible matchups. Some of the others are a little bit in the middle, which I think Angels comes out in a dog in a lot of those matchups. So this is a deck you play in a very aggro-heavy matchup or meta, or if you're playing Explorer, it's very good in Best of 1, as there's a lot more aggressive decks in that format. But overall, this is a deck that has a lot of polarized matchups. They can be very, very good, very, very bad. Kind of has a middling middling positioning in as far as the format. So if it's a deck you kind of like, you can play it, maybe learn a little bit of tricks as far as sequencing and such, learning to perfect the sideboard, maybe you can get a few points here and there. This isn't really a deck that really strains you too hard on the interactions. Obviously, there's a lot of triggers to keep track of in terms of life gain and Giada triggers coming into play and all that stuff. Really are some other keys to the deck. But really, this is a deck that's kind of the anti-aggro tribal deck and also has the slight bonus of being okay against Rakdos Midrange while tending to struggle against the big mana decks, mono green, Lotus Field combo, and also struggling against decks like Greasefang and blue-white control. So hopefully this gives you a much better idea of where Green-White Angel stands in the format. This is kind of a supplement to the original deck guide that we did about a year ago or so, and it has about a month's worth of gameplay between a few Pioneer Leagues and a lot of gameplay on Explore. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of where the Angels deck stands in the format.